Welcome to today's session on overview of the garment manufacturing process. This is the first session and we are broadly going to talk about understanding the Indian apparel industry. That's number one. Number two is apparel production systems. And third, we are going to talk about apparel engineering. Now, all of these are part of the apparel industry in India and the various methods which are being used by the various apparel manufacturers in India. So first we are going to talk about the Indian apparel industry. Indian apparel industry, primarily we are going to talk about the garment manufacturers, including the raw material suppliers and the manufacturers and of course the retailers. Now, understanding the Indian apparel industry, if you go back in time, if we see that India, because it was part of the British colony, the development of apparel manufacturing was severely constrained, primarily for the fact that Britain was more interested in boosting the textile and clothing industry in Britain, primarily Manchester. And that's why we see that the Indian markets in terms of garment manufacturing is about 10 decades younger than the Western counterpart. Apparel manufacturing activities had started way back in Europe as well as in America. Manchester was one of the key city which saw plenty of activity related to textile manufacturing, and then Massachusetts in US in the East Coast happened to be another center which came up in a huge way when we talk about apparel manufacturing in an industrialized manner. Of course, post-independence, India took up the reins and tried to gather as much speed and put in a lot of resources to revive its textile manufacturing and then apparel manufacturing. And in these 7 decades, India has been able to catch up with the Western counterparts to a large extent. And today it happens to be the 4th largest textile and clothing exporter in the world. Of course, the advent of NIFT in 1986 was a great factor which brought a fair amount of mission vision and a particular direction to the apparel industry. And of course, with that, it also gave birth to designer wear in India. And since then, Indian fashion industry has evolved. It has given us a lot of designers like Manish Arora and Ritu Kumar and Rohit Bal, people who have made a name for themselves. People like Manish Arora and a lot of other designers. And of course, the Indian apparel industry has seen phenomenal growth, both in terms of domestic markets as well as exports. If you look at the international market, India provides fashion at competitive prices with short lead time and an effective monopoly in designs. Is the default source in the hand embroidered garment segment. Now, when we say competitive prices, India used to be fairly competitive in the late 90s and early 2000s, but because of various factors, today in the last 2 decades, China has been one of the most cost-effective producers and exporter of apparel, and along with that we have seen the emergence of Bangladesh and Vietnam, which have taken away a large part of the export market, apparel export market from India. So yeah, India still is in a position to give competitive prices despite the disbalance in the custom duties which are levied by European Union and USA on the Indian products. And then India has been able to improve its efficiency to an extent that it is able to match up to the lead time as offered by the other countries. Now, lead time is the amount of time or the number of days which a manufacturer takes from the date of getting the order till the date of delivering the goods. So a lot of Indian manufacturers have been able to give competitive lead time to the customers, to the buyers, because of which there is a fair amount of business coming to India in terms of exports. And 2019, India did an exports of $20 billion in textile exports and $20 billion in apparel exports. And till early 2000s, India had an effective monopoly in designs. India has been a land of designers and designs. The Mughal designs, that the Mughal effect that we can see in most of the value-added products that we have in India, Zardozi, sequins, dabka, beadwork, and so many things. So India has a very long legacy of, if you talk about the designs. So to a large extent, India still enjoys that monopoly in designs, and it used to be a default source in the hand embroidered garment segment. But today, if we see, China has been able to mechanize this entire process of embroidery as well as sequin work, and today China has been able to make such machines which can simulate the production, simulate the hand embroidery and the sequin work and other value additions, and because of which China has been able to again snatch away a fair share of the value-added garment orders, the global orders. So yeah, that is a cause of concern for the Indian apparel industry. And if we look at the current status of the textile and apparel market, so the total textile and apparel market in India is 150 billion US dollars. Now, when we are saying this 150 billion dollars, it's the sum is the value of the total amount of textile and apparel being produced in India, and out of which $40 billion is being exported to the various countries in the world, and the domestic market consumes about 110 billion US dollars of textile and apparel. And if we see the breakup of this $150 billion, what we can see is that out of this 110 is domestic market, $40 billion is exports. Out of this $110 billion in India, we are looking at about $27 billion worth of textiles being produced and consumed in India, and about $83 billion worth of clothing being consumed in India within the Indian market itself. And if you look at the exports, $40 billion, about half of this is exports of textiles, and the rest half is exports of clothing, exports to the world. And if anything to go by, if you look at the significance of textile and clothing in India, the current scenario illustrates that 14% of all industrial production comes from the production of textile and clothing. out of the total exports earning that India enjoys, 50% of that comes from textile and clothing exports. And all the activities that are happening within India, which contribute to the GDP, 4% of that GDP comes from textile and clothing. And one of the best things about textile and clothing is that textile and clothing industry employs 60 million people directly and 45 million people indirectly. And textile and clothing happens to be the largest employer in India, second only to agriculture. And even if you look at the total global market, India has a significant share of about 5% of the total global market in terms of textile and clothing. And if you look at the share of apparel in total exports, if India, let's say, if India exports 100 rupees worth of goods to the world, out of that 7.04 rupees comes from apparel. And India ranks 4th in the world apparel export today. And if you talk about the various centers or clusters or cities which have evolved over a period of last few decades, which have been primarily engaged in very high amount of activity related to textile and clothing exports, textile and clothing manufacturing. Delhi and NCR happens to be one of the largest exporter of apparel, where Delhi specializes in ladies wear. Again, when we talk about ladies wear, Delhi is very, very good with value-added products, both in terms of ladies' blouses and skirts and dresses and designer products or high-value items. And if you talk about Mumbai happens to house most of the mills, cotton mills, and therefore, by virtue of that, happens to be one of those centers for mill-made products, men's shirts, and other products made of mill-made cottons. And if you look at Bangalore, which has come up in a large way, most of these companies like Shahi and Gokuldas Exports, etc., they have set up their very many factories in Bengaluru, and Bengaluru happens to be very good in terms of manufacturing of denim products, and then mill-made menswear, women's wear, men's shirt, and other products. To a large extent, Tirupur, which is down south, happens to be the largest hub of t-shirt manufacturing and exporting, where every small household seems to be directly or indirectly related to the manufacturing of t-shirts. On the other hand, if you look at Ludhiana happens to be the sweater hub of India, is the largest manufacturer of sweaters, both cotton as well as woolen, acrylic and polyester. And of course, Ludhiana has been quick to develop parallelly the manufacturing of t-shirts also, and the huge companies like Oswal Woolen Mills and the likes, they have been able to occupy a large share of t-shirt manufacturing as well as sweaters in India, and they're very, very bullish on the sweater exports also. If we look at Jammu and Kashmir, Jammu happens to be one of these hubs for manufacturing of embroidered shawls. And if you look at Indore happens to house the factory of Pratibha Syntex. Pratibha Syntex happens to be in Indore, in the outskirts, and it happens to be the largest exporter of products, garments made of organic cotton. There is a fair amount of activity in terms of apparel manufacturing exports in Hyderabad, and then few export houses have been set up in Vizag, Visakhapatnam, and if you look at Kolkata happens to be a huge hub of manufacturing of men's undergarments, mostly cotton. Of course, happens to have a significant share of jute production in India, jute products and apparel made of jute, and then there are various other small cities which are connected to these big cities, where some secondary and tertiary and auxiliary activities are being undertaken by various outfits in these small cities. So when we talk about Delhi, there is a lot of activity happening in Gurgaon. Then there is a lot of manufacturing and exporting activity happening in Noida and Faridabad, and then it has extended to interiors of Ghaziabad. And Bareilly happens to be one of the largest hub of handwork in all of India, and most of the very big orders of handwork, the handwork value addition activity is shifted from is passed on, outsourced from Delhi and NCR to Bareilly. So a lot of interesting structure that we have in India. And if you look at the Indian knitting industry clusters, when we're looking at knitting industry, we are looking at warp knit and weft knit. And when we are talking about warp knit, we're looking at the upholstery industry, which uses warp knit textile, and the sweaters and the t-shirts that we see, these are all weft knitted products. And out of these weft knitted products, we have circular knit and we have flat knit. Flat knits are the fabrics from which we make sweaters, and circular knits are those fabrics from which the t-shirts are made. So coming back to this slide, in India there are three distinguishable prime clusters related to knitting: knitted fabrics and garment manufacturing, that is KFG; knitwear manufacturing, which is sweaters; and warp knit fabrics, which is WK. Warp knit fabrics is related to the upholstery industry. Now, some of the above type of industry is located at secondary and tertiary clusters within or without the prime clusters. So like I said, that there are some cities which are connected to the primary cluster, and there are some which are situated away from and not connected with the prime cluster. They're located at secondary or tertiary clusters. And if you look at the location of knitting industry in India, we're looking at Ludhiana, Tirupur, Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, Bangalore, Surat and Amritsar, where we see that the prime centers for knitwear fabrics and garments is Tirupur, where where a lot of production of t-shirts is happening. If you look at Ludhiana, Delhi, and Mumbai and Kolkata, these are the secondary centers where knitwear fabrics and garments are made. And if you look at the knitwear manufacturing, which is sweaters, so sweaters primarily the largest activity is happening in Ludhiana, whereas slight amount of activity is happening in Tirupur, Delhi, Mumbai and Bangalore. And warp knit, if you see, which is very specialized, mostly related to the automobile industry, the upholstery which is used. So most of it is because these warp knits are made of polyester, which have to be very, very sturdy, because it is used in these cars and other automobiles. So if you talk about polyesters and viscose, automatically we shift our focus to Surat and Ahmedabad, which is the hub for all the all the textile material and garments made of polyesters and viscose. So we see that Surat happens to be the largest center for manufacturing of warp knit fabrics and products. So with that we come to we would like to summarize the Indian garment industry in terms of the SWOT analysis, and if we look at the strengths, India has been a country which has had the tradition of textile and garments since time immemorial, since Ramayana and Mahabharata. So traditionally we've been rich with textiles and apparel. We have abundant and relatively cheap skilled workforce, although the labor is not so cheap anymore, relatively speaking. Raw materials, we are very good with cottons. We're good with silk. We are the second largest manufacturer of silk in the world, China being the largest. And then there are we have the raw material which is petroleum, from which polyesters and viscose can be made. Polyester can be made, polyester and nylon, and we have Aditya Birla happens to be the largest organization in the world which produces viscose or rayon. So again, India has no dearth of raw material supplies. And then of course the Indian population has been growing at a rapid pace, and along with this population, the consuming capacity of the great Indian middle class also has been increasing at a fast pace, which represents the large and growing domestic market. And of course, India happens to house a lot of big factories, but not so many. And on the other hand, it has thousands and thousands of mid-size and lakhs of very small apparel manufacturers. So, and they are like really very cost-effective to produce. And so the big ones, they are very cost-effective. They can produce at very low costs. And the small ones, they have huge manufacturing flexibility. You want to get 5 or 10 pieces made, 20 pieces made, 100 pieces made. There are thousands of manufacturers who will be ready to give you this service. Unlike the huge factories in China, which do not take up small orders like 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 pieces. They only pick up orders which are like 1 lakh, 2 lakh pieces per style. And of course, India is the largest producer of cotton, second largest exporter of cotton, silk, and man-made fibers. India has not really been very high on man-made fibers, rightly so, because man-made fibers are not so good for the nature, for the ecosystem. But India is really not deployed a lot of resources in the manufacturing of man-made fibers. So it's a catching up act, and India has less than 3 to 5% share in the world market of man-made fibers. India has a wide portfolio. India pretty much makes everything under the sun, if you're talking about textile and clothing. And of course, India is a hub for value-added services, products like sequin work, beadwork, ari, chicken embroidery, etc. India does all of that. So these are some of the strengths of the Indian apparel industry. Weaknesses, if we talk about technologically, we've been backward. Still, there is a lot of investments required in terms of machinery and equipment, buying of latest technologies, which would help in improving the quality, improving the consistency, increasing the speed, efficiency, productivity, and things like that. And then we have this intersector rivalry, the organized versus unorganized. Now, organized sector is something which is registered, does things in an orderly manner, and complies with the government rules and regulations, and because of which the cost of production is higher. But when we talk about the unorganized sector, most of them are non-registered. They do not pay taxes and things like that, and therefore they are able to produce the product at lower prices. But then they lack in terms of branding, in terms of quality, consistency, marketing, branding, and things like that. So there is always a tussle between the organized and unorganized, and especially when we are talking about the counterfeit market. There's an original Nike, and there are thousands of manufacturers who are making these fake Nike products. So there's a tussle between these two almost all the time. And then there is lack of indigenous research. India has been a little weak, or let's say has not really focused so much on research, which is something which India must focus on if it were to hold its stand against China, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. And then the productivity still happens to be low. Most of the factories which have not really been able to keep up with the global standards, the global benchmark in terms of productivity, thousands of factories have perished. And the ones which are existing have learned the lesson the hard way. And it is something which requires immediate attention, both from the industry side as well as from the government side, Minister of Textiles. And if we talk about opportunity, there are it's a growing industry. There is integration of information technology, which has helped in making the system more robust. Monitoring has become almost automated. Planning IT systems have helped in improving the planning much better than what humans could do earlier. And of course, there is opportunity in high value items. China has been one of those pioneers who took the advantage of making the first move and getting into the manufacturing of high value items as well. And one of the in China happens to have the one of the largest share of this high value items being sold in the global markets. China has about 35% of the share in the world. And if you look at the threats, there is decreased fashion cycle, there is fast fashion is changing rapidly, and therefore almost all the brands like Zara to start with, and then of course H&M and El Corte Fiel, C&A, Tesco, Next, H&M, Walmart, all of them have to bow down to the pressure of fast fashion, because of which there is more number of fashion happening. The fashion seasons, there are more number of fashion seasons within a year, which is creating a lot of pressure on the manufacturers. And so China and Bangladesh and other low-cost nations have been posing a threat to India. They have been taking away a lot of business from India because of their speed, because of great lead time, because of the labor productivity. And on the other side, the labor cost in India has been rising steadily. So China, Bangladesh and Vietnam, their labor has been becoming more effective, more efficient, while India's labor has been continuously becoming more expensive. So India is getting beaten from both the sides. So with that, we come to the end of this particular section. In the next section, we are going to talk about apparel production systems which are used in India.